The year is 2150. The Milky Way and surrounding galaxies are controlled by one force that all started on Earth. Is it the United States? Russia? Maybe Great Britain started colonizing again. If you chose the United States, you're close, at least kind of. The force that controls all of this is Ohio. Yeah, the one that used to be a state. How did this all happen? Well, it all started on March 1st, 1803, when Ohio became part of the United States. An official state. Now, the moment Ohio was officially part of the United States, it started planning its takeover. Its first official attempt was in 1862 during the Civil War. However, that didn't work. It tried again during World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and on the 27th of July, 1987. Nothing actually started working until 2028, when World War III started. Russia, China, North Korea, and Sealand formed an alliance, and the United States, Canada, Great Britain, France, Italy, Australia, and the Mongolian Empire started working together in order to combat this. Now, this was a chaotic period of time, a lot of political confusion, fear over the war, going nuclear, and people fleeing to countries like Sweden and Texas. Texas had split off from the United States following the White House incident and chose to remain neutral during World War III. Ohio debated on using brute force to take over the United States. However, a majority of Ohio troops were overseas fighting, and it couldn't beat 48 and a half other states, so it decided to play the political game. It sent its politicians to some surrounding states and New Mexico. The politicians quickly got voted into important offices and governor of the states. By October 11th of 2029, Ohio controlled 7 states, politically at least. Now, at this point, World War III had been raging on for 2 years, and it was still unclear who would win, if anyone would win. Ohio was taking over more states and was preparing to try to take Canada, and there was a possibility that World War III could turn into a nuclear war. Ohio knew it had to act quickly, because if a nuclear war broke out, then the world would be destroyed or at least rendered useless, and that means nothing to take over. So, taking a risk, in 2030, Ohio uses 11 states to try to take over the United States. However, just days before the planned attack, Ohio was sold out by Illinois. Or Illinois, if that's how you choose to pronounce it, a state that was believed to have been taken over. The United States quickly detained any threat Ohio had and removed the state government, and was set to be directly controlled by the US government, giving it little to no options. However, after a heartfelt apology letter from Ohio 2 months later, the US gave it back the state government and most of its freedoms. However, it was kept under heavy watch. While usually this would have been enough to end any rebellion from Ohio for at least a while, it still had control of some of the surrounding states, which it used to expand to 15 states from their original 11. However, this time it avoided doing Illinois due to being sold out by it last time. It was going to save something special for it. Ohio had control of 15 states, however the US government was closely watching Ohio due to the previous incidents. Ohio could no longer operate in its own state due to the surveillance, so it switched its head operation area to Wisconsin, so it would still border Canada and was near states that had yet been taken over. However, within a couple of months, the United States began getting invaded by the enemy, specifically the Russians and China. North Korea was busy with the war in Asia, and Sealand was busy fighting the British Navy. The United States was being invaded from the west, so Ohio seized this opportunity to solidify its location in the United States by rushing to take over the states while the US was distracted. It was able to connect with the group of states set over by New Mexico, fortifying Ohio's territory while being under the cover that all the states were still under the power of the US. With the United States getting weaker every day, Ohio grew stronger, soon taking over nearly all states that were still within the United States' power. At this point, Ohio was battling the invading forces and was merely waiting for the right time to reveal when to split off from the United States, then take over what was left of it. However, while biding time, things started to go downhill. Ohio began losing states to Russia and China, and it knew that if it didn't split now, then it would be overpowered and taken over. Ohio made the choice to split from the United States and form its own country. This event caused mass confusion in the world and a temporary ceasefire from China and Russia to figure things out. During this time, the remainder of the citizens loyal to the United States fled to Illinois or Florida. Granted, Florida very quickly became its own country, renaming itself Florida, which was pronounced the same way as Florida, just had an extra letter. It also switched to a dead form of Latin that they renamed Floridian, and it went from a democracy to a tribe system based on ritual combat and worshipping crocodile-based deities, much like the Egyptians worshipped cats. And all of this meant that Illinois was the only part of the United States left, and the capital of the United States was quickly set to be Valley City, Illinois, and a wall constructed at the country borders in a futile attempt to hold out. For the moment, Ohio let them be and focused on capturing the rest of what used to be the United States. With the current ceasefire with Russia and China, Ohio focused on taking Texas and Florida. Ohio began setting up troops at the Texas border. However, Texas, which had planned for something like this, was prepared. Using massive thrusters and a giant space dome, Texas launched itself off the Earth and set itself in orbit. The force of the thrusters caused massive earthquakes all over the United States, resulting in California and Florida splitting off from the continent, with California partially sinking, and Florida getting caught in the ocean currents, ending up in a currently unknown location somewhere in the ocean. Ohio, after recovering from the earthquakes, immediately began the attack on the controlled West, catching the Russians and Chinese by surprise and taking back several states. For several months, the border stayed about the same, until the war in Europe and Asia intensified, and the invading forces had to pull out and send units to that fight, except for California, which they turned into a naval and ship base due to the fact that it's easier to defend now that it was out in the water and now an island. The land that used to be the United States was completely Ohio's. A few things had gone wrong, such as Texas setting itself into orbit, and Florida being lost somewhere in the ocean. However, for the most part, Ohio's plan was going well, although it was all an uphill battle from here.
Ohio had what was once the United States. Most of it anyways. Ohio, after a month of gaining troops and supplies, took California, which was fairly easy because the war in Europe kept China and Russia distracted. Ohio also took Hawaii over at the same time. Now, Ohio was ready to start taking over different countries. It debated on what would be the best course of action. Take Canada and Mexico? Go for Japan? Maybe even try for Sealand? Finally decided to make its move. After a 15-minute war, Poland was now under the control of Ohio. Now, with this foothold in Europe, Ohio could finally move off the continent of North America and expand to Europe. So of course Ohio decided to do the smart thing, and it declared war on Canada and attacked them, taking over a few provinces within a matter of weeks. However, Mexico, which was allied with Canada, worked together to try to fight back against Ohio. This constant warfare lasted about 6 months until Ohio decided to make a move. Overnight, Ohio sent its agents to poison Canada's national syrup supply, a facility that held over 1.7 million gallons of maple syrup, the facility being the equivalent of Fort Knox, but for syrup. Ohio sent in a small group of 20 agents. None of them returned alive. However, one of them managed to poison it. Within weeks, the nation of Canada was now Ohio. Mexico fell only 3 months afterwards. Ohio immediately focused on taking over Greenland in order to control the entire continent of North America. However, there was some confusion and Ohio accidentally took over Iceland instead of Greenland. During the 3 months in between the capture of Canada and the capture of Mexico during 2032, the two sides of World War III, that being Russia, China, North Korea, and Sealand, and the other side consisting of Great Britain, France, Italy, Australia, and the Mongolian Empire, decided to call a ceasefire in order to work together to take out Ohio due to its growing threat. This temporary group was called Mr. Worldwide and immediately set to planning on destroying Ohio. They first removed Ohio's foothold in Europe by taking Poland from them. However, upon going to take it, they discovered Germany had beat them to it. Germany then of course decided to join the group of countries, mainly to avoid any sort of consequences for taking Poland. They then started gathering troops and supplies to prepare for the siege of North America. Ohio had most of North America under its control. However, it still wanted all of it, so Ohio immediately set out to take Greenland, this time making sure not to make a mistake and end up in Iceland like last time. However, after hearing Ohio was after them, Greenland legally changed its name to Iceland and switched Iceland's name to Greenland, so Ohio ended up taking over Iceland again, under the impression it was Greenland this time. After thinking they had Greenland, Ohio immediately set to planning on taking over Europe, aware that Germany had taken back Poland from them, but not aware that the group of countries, aka Mr. Worldwide, was currently putting into action their plan on defeating Ohio. Ohio spent 2 months training their army and preparing to launch a full-out assault on Europe, which was then shortened into a 20-second training montage of seemingly unrelated events with inspiring music played in the background. During these 2 months, however, the group Mr. Worldwide, here referred to as the acronym MWW, was preparing for the siege of Ohio, or rather the entirety of North America. Using the strength of Sealand and Great Britain's navy, the berserker-like ability of the Russians, and the combined forces of the rest of the countries, they devised a plan to surround Ohio and take it out in one quick, decisive move. However, on February 24th of 2033, the day before the attack, disaster struck the MWW. Taiwan, using the advantage of the chaos Ohio had caused, overthrew the Chinese government and remade China as West Taiwan. Atlantis also resurfaced after it had vanished for 1,000 years, and challenged Sealand's authority of the seas. Sealand's navy wasn't big enough to fight 2 wars, so this ultimately forced Sealand out of the MWW, and marked the beginning of the Sea Time War, in which modern technology faced off against ancient magic. With these two countries now out of the group, the MWW had to back out of its current plan and try to re-strategize. However, the British Navy had already been set up to bombard the East Coast during the attack and planned to refuel at the East Coast afterwards. At the order of the retreat, they turned back and made it halfway across the ocean before running out of fuel, allowing the Ohio Navy to catch up. The Battle of the T lasted 2 days, with both sides suffering heavy losses, Ohio losing 75% of its navy and Britain only losing 60%. Realizing the risk of defeat, Captain James S. Kirk, captain of the Ohio Navy, demanded the surrender of the British fleet, which was run by Captain Franz M. British. After the British Navy refused to surrender, the Ohio Navy threatened to pour 15 metric tons of tea into the ocean. This threat was met with the surrender of the British Navy. After discovering that this Hail Mary move would indeed work against Great Britain, Ohio negotiated a deal using tea as leverage that put Britain out of the MWW and would result in Ohio selling tea to Britain at a low price with no tariffs. The year was now 2035. 2 years had gone by quickly and quietly. The MWW and Ohio both growing in strength and strategizing. It was a Cold War, constant fear, but nothing ever happened. Until July of 2035, when Ohio learned that Britain had created a device that they would finish within a month, that would counter Ohio's threats of pouring tea into the ocean. Ohio, realizing that they were running out of time, set up a 3-part plan that would take over the coast of Europe along with Britain, eliminating a threat and gaining a foothold on European soil. The plan was nicknamed D-Day, except way less dramatic and can be more similarly compared to that time when we took over Poland in 15 minutes, or, for short, Dual Dak Bumskizruap. The 3-part plan consisted of the first step, separating Britain from outside help by using boats to barricade the waterways. The second part consisted of setting up a fleet which would hover near the shores a week before the battle in order to distract countries. They would then send in all of the soldiers to Portugal and have them work their way up the countries. After the troops take over Portugal and Spain, the fleet would begin to bombard the coast area of the Netherlands, before sending in more troops which would attack France's border at the same time. Afterwards, they would all focus on Great Britain and take it over. The plan was perfect on paper, and worked perfectly all the way up to attacking France, in which France ruined their plan by surrendering. The Ohioan troops entered France without resistance and headed towards the coastline to prepare for the siege on Britain. This is where things went wrong. The MWW had set up troops along the French border that began moving forward, following the Ohioan troops from a distance. The French troops began attacking the army from the front, while the MWW attacked from the back, effectively cornering the Ohioan troops, keeping them from escaping. While the troops were fighting inland, the seatime war began to have its effects on the world, with tides changing and sea storms becoming more common and worse than before, causing issues with the fleet of ships Ohio had stationed near the coast. A few ships sinking before Ohio had to pull the fleet back away from the coast where the storms were the worst, leaving the army temporarily behind. Ohio scrambled to come up with a counterplan to save their army. When they finally came up with a strategy, they settled on an ambitious plan which was the scale in which the world had never seen. Seizing civilian aircraft, Ohio briefly trained over 100,000 soldiers on parachuting and sent them off, airdropping them at several points throughout France, surrounding the French and MWW's army, forcing them to fight on 2 fronts. The largest group of soldiers consisted of 20,000, whose job was to pierce through the side and create an opening to evacuate the rest of the army. The plan was successful, so successful that the army disobeyed orders and continued fighting when they were supposed to have pulled out and returned to Ohio to regroup and replan. And as most things tend to do, it went downhill and fast. Ohio's army had disobeyed orders and decided to continue fighting with the intent to destroy the MWW's army. However, as we all saw coming, things went poorly. A hurricane caused by the seatime war blew over France with 100-mile-per-hour winds, hail, and frequent lightning. The entire army collapsed due to panic and loss of leadership. The MWW had taken heavy losses but managed to keep the remaining troops alive due to a preparation in a town nearby that they'd stayed in. And, to make matters worse, Britain had created the device that they could use to render Ohio's threats of pouring tea into the ocean useless. They redeclared war on Ohio and joined the MWW once again with a bigger navy than before and more preparation on how to fight against Ohio's navy. Ohio had pulled back its navy and could only watch as the enemy forces slowly moved towards North America, taking back countries that Ohio had taken. Within a week, the MWW was on Ohio's doorstep, and Ohio had only its Air Force and Navy to defend itself. Ohio was preparing itself for the attack when suddenly a majority of the MWW's army and navy pulled back, leaving only a part of it behind. What happened? Well, Taiwan wasn't satisfied with only China. They had taken over nearly the entire continent of Asia and had begun to press into Europe, causing the MWW to pull back and defend themselves from the attack. While the MWW was distracted with Taiwan, Ohio began to carry out its plans, silently.
Meanwhile, not silently, the Sea-Time War continued. Atlantis and Sealand still fighting each other, no signs of victory for either. Their fighting was causing changes in the weather and ocean currents. One of these changes caught an iceberg and forced it into the fifth recreation of the Titanic. The other three modern Titanics had all been sunk by icebergs, but no one seemed to learn that recreating it was a bad idea. This Titanic sank on top of the city of Atlantis, damaging the bubble it was enclosed in. Atlantis realized they were taking in more water than they could stop, so they prepared to play their trump card. Meanwhile, Taiwan was pushing the MWW back and taking over more and more land. While that was going on, Ohio finalized the explosives. Then, all in an instant, everything changed. Atlantis pulled the plug on the ocean with the intent to destroy Sealand. The major currents pulled the island of Taiwan around the continent of Africa and into the Atlantic Ocean. Ohio set off the explosives, releasing an iceberg the size of Texas into the ocean. It too got caught by the currents and was pulled towards the drain at high speeds when it got pulled down and replugged the hole. When the dust settled, it was revealed the world's geography was forever changed. Florida had been pulled and gotten stuck between Japan and West Taiwan, making Japan no longer an island. Taiwan was now stuck in the Atlantic Ocean and was promptly taken over by Atlantis when Atlantis' city had been destroyed due to the drain. Iceland and Greenland had somehow changed positions, although no one could figure out how. Ohio was fuming because the iceberg wasn't meant to plug the hole, but rather slide across Europe, crushing everything in its path. Hawaii was pulled into the gap between California and North America, making it so that California was no longer an island, but part of a continent. West Taiwan became its own democratic government once Taiwan was taken over, and Sealand was nowhere to be seen. It was assumed that Atlantis' plan was successful and they were pulled down the drain. The world's geography had been forever changed, and somehow water levels had only temporarily lowered, then raised, the ocean returning to normal again. Atlantis, which had taken the island of Taiwan for themselves, declared themselves to be a neutral nation now that their enemy Sealand was gone. Ohio took them over 15 minutes after said declaration. Ohio had also figured out where Iceland was located on a map, so they went to go take Iceland over, only to end up taking out Greenland once again because the map hadn't been updated for that week's latest geography shift. Ohio finally set to trying to take Europe once again, however this time they went for a different strategy. Instead of hitting Europe from the ocean, they would enter through land. So within a couple of weeks, Ohio had the country of Africa under its control, much to the dismay of many of its citizens that said things like, "We aren't states, we're countries," and "Africa is a continent, not a country." But Ohio ignored them and took over the country anyways. The next step was taking over Asia so that they could enter Europe through two fronts. That's where they met opposition. They started by trying to take over the country of Japan, only to realize Florida had beaten them to it. Not deterred by this, they still tried to take it over, only to discover that it was infested by alligators, and all of its citizens were now superhumans due to the sheer amount of cocaine flowing through their veins. The attack was a complete loss, Ohio not even standing any sort of chance at brute forcing their way into it. Deterred by this, but not quite giving up, Ohio went around Japan, taking over a couple of countries, and discovered that Florida had not yet gone for West Taiwan. Using this to their advantage, they took over West Taiwan, then quickly set up a blockade, using small bags filled with what looked like cocaine to bait in unsuspecting Floridians to make sure they didn't spread. Ohio then set up a front line to defend against any possible attacks from the west and north, then headed south to take over the islands, reaching Australia in a matter of weeks. For a month they fought, but eventually Australia realized they weren't going to win. So in a last-ditch effort, they launched a rocket nicknamed Pandora's Box with a payload of destruction no man had ever seen. The Pandora A61, otherwise known as the Pandora's Box missile, was an ICBM designed as a last resort in the case of Australia facing defeat. Able to go up to 17,000 miles per hour, the Pandora A61 could reach any continent within 45 minutes. Virtually undetectable, even if it was caught on radar, it'd be nearly impossible to shoot down due to a graphene compound used as the outer shell. However, a missile is nothing without its payload, and the payload on the Pandora was arguably more powerful than any nuclear warhead. Instead of using explosives, Pandora used living creatures, a bioweapon of sorts. There were 3 pods within the shell, each 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. Each pod had its own stage. The first pod would release as the missile set into the landing stage in order to prevent tampering with it. Once the missile had landed, it would shoot out the second pod. There would then be a 50-minute time before the last and most deadly stage would be released. And when Ohio was about to take over Australia, they launched the missile, directly at the capital of Ohio, which was located in what was once the original state of Ohio. Everything went exactly as planned for the missile. It landed in a forested area near the capital, dropping out drop bears for protection. While the drop bears protected the missile, it launched a second pod out, which turned into an automatic turret which would launch textile cone snails at anything that came too close. demanding they surrender, otherwise they would lose everything to this missile. Ohio, of course, refused to surrender, and 15 minutes later, right as Ohio was about to take over Australia, the missile launched its final capsule out. At first there was rejoicing because nothing came out of it. No explosion, no creatures, no anything. But that's when the humming noise started. It sounded like a swarm of bees, but worse. And from there, everything went wrong. Inside that last container was a swarm of Goliath bird-eating spiders. But even worse, they had wings and were able to rapidly breed. Within an hour, Ohio had lost the capital city to them. An executive decision was quickly made. They had to burn down the state. So without hesitation, they lit what was once the state of Ohio on fire. At first, it seemed like it was working, and a sacrifice had saved them. But out of the fire came the Goliath bird-eating spiders, which were very much alive, now on fire, and even more upset. A second executive decision was made, and they used a thruster system implanted in the state, which was inspired by Texas, to launch it into space, completely removing the spiders from the face of the planet and into orbit around the Earth. As Ohio was distracted by the spiders, the remainder of Australia fled to New Zealand, leaving Ohio with an empty country. Ohio gave chase only to discover that New Zealand had switched locations with a different Zealand, named Old Zealand, which promptly became Old Ohio. There was a brief moment of celebration before things began to go wrong again. After the state of Ohio had been sent into orbit, it was discovered that there were large tunnels running underneath the surface of the Earth, and out of those tunnels came the army of Sealand. As it turns out, when Sealand got pulled down the drain, it didn't get destroyed, but rather relocated under the planet's crust. And they had spent that time building an army up and preparing for war. Unprepared for an attack from within, Ohio rapidly lost land until they were able to stabilize themselves by relocating troops back to North America. However, as things often do, it got worse. Ohio had turned a blind eye to Florida, and Florida had gotten around their barricade by riding on the backs of alligators to Ukraine, which was formerly known as Russia before Ukraine took it over. And not only did they take over Ukraine, they combined with them, creating a horrible crossbreed between Ukrainians and Floridians that was seemingly invincible to everything. And they immediately began hammering away at the land Ohio had taken in Asia. Ohio, torn between two battlefronts, had to make a choice: abandon Asia, leaving the continent for the Floridians, allowing them to grow in strength, or put all of their men into crushing them and leaving North America to potentially be lost to Sealand. Before they were able to make a choice, a mysterious being that was 3 feet tall, wore a cloak, and sounded suspiciously like a bird appeared. Without a word, it created a large hole in central Russia, giving them access to the tunnels before leaving. The Floridians pulled back their armies from Asia and sent them down to investigate the new hole, where they stumbled across Sealand's army and began fighting them. Sealand pulled all of its troops back to face this new threat, and Florida sent its troops down the tunnels to keep Sealand from invading. While they were busy with this, Ohio seized the opportunity and plugged both the holes with cement and dirt, the equivalent of sweeping a problem under the rug and hoping it doesn't come back to bite you later. With both these threats gone, Ohio quickly recovered and took over the land Florida had taken, solidifying its defenses against Western Europe. Ohio finally seemed to be getting a steady grip on the world, and nope, scratch that. A little over a week after Sealand and Florida got contained in the tunnels, their series of fights led to major tunnels around the world collapsing and being filled with water. These series of continent-wide canals were appropriately called the Divides. While these canals were mildly inconvenient, they didn't necessarily stop Ohio's plans. But they did, however, give a very strong boost to Kyrgyzstan, who had been building the world's largest navy using dry docks, even though they were also the world's most landlocked country. This is what ended up interfering with Ohio's plans. Immediately, Kyrgyzstan started sending out ships going on naval bombing runs along Ohio's territory. Ohio's navy, when they put up an effort against Kyrgyzstan, was crushed due to the confusion and the sheer numbers of the opposing fleets. Ohio attempted to attack via land, however, the Divides had formed a moat of sorts around the country, and any attempts to cross were brutally stopped, forcing Ohio to pull back. After weeks of failed attempts, Ohio was running out of ideas. But this time, luck appeared to be on Ohio's side, as a major storm blew through the area, causing massive flooding, and Kyrgyzstan's navy was forced to draw back to the ports to avoid potentially sinking. This left the boats as sitting ducks. The storm lasted 6 hours. Kyrgyzstan was defeated within 4 of those. Ohio had the world in the palm of its hand. With the ever-growing size of its army, the only threat left to it was the potential of nuclear annihilation. Wary of this, Ohio postponed its plans in Europe and instead focused on taking over South America and the rest of Asia. Ohio sent out a declaration to all of the countries on these 2 continents, demanding they surrender peacefully, otherwise they'd have to face a hostile takeover. A few countries in Asia complied, handing themselves over. However, nearly all of South America surrendered, except for one country, Uruguay. Ohio was outraged by this, as not having the continent greatly weakened them. As per the rules of the board game Risk, if you have more continents, you get more armies. Determined to get this boost, Ohio sent a large portion of their army to flatten the country. However, much like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it didn't go as easily as planned. Uruguay, despite having a far smaller army, held their own, taking out at least 4 of Ohio's troops for every one of theirs. Ohio sent more troops in, and despite the holdout from Uruguay, there was only so much they could do by themselves. For every battalion they defeated, a new one replaced it, and for every battalion they lost, there was nothing to replace it. And so, under the crushing weight of Ohio's army, Uruguay fell. Although this was a victory for Ohio, in some ways it was a crushing defeat. The rest of the world that was rebelling against Ohio watched it all happen, and realized that despite Ohio's power, it could be defeated. This led to an increase in the resolve of the remaining countries to stay free from Ohio. All of the remaining countries that weren't already part of the MWW sent in their applications to join, hoping now to join together in an attempt to stop Ohio. However, the MWW and its countries stayed silent, as they had been for nearly a year now. Ohio had just assumed that they were too scared to do anything. However, there were rumors now spreading that the MWW was working on a way to stop Ohio. Of course, without the help of the MWW, the countries in Asia fell fast, failing to imitate the strength that had been shown by Uruguay. However, in the midst of this, Ohio received a phone call from India. India offered them a deal. Ohio would tell them the numbers on the front and back of West Taiwan, and India would give Ohio the entirety of the MWW. This, of course, was a scam. However, India had cracked down on scammers years previously and managed to shut nearly all of them down, causing scams to be extremely rare. However, India had pulled these scammers out of jail and offered to shave years off their prison sentence if they helped them form a plan to stand against Ohio. And their plan worked. Ohio fell for the scam, giving India all of the information to West Taiwan, and India immediately used it to take over West Taiwan, growing in strength. Ohio, of course, realized it was a scam almost immediately after it happened, and was furious. However, they had an expert who had been in the business of scamming scammers for years, Mark Rober, and they commissioned him to make the Glitter Bomb 27.0. And after a month or so, using help from Ohio, it was a complete. They left the package in India and watched as it worked its magic. And by magic, I mean the thermonuclear warhead mixed with glitter. The explosion sent 107,000 metric tons of glitter into the air. This amount of glitter, of course, would basically mimic the ash from a volcanic eruption, blocking out the sunlight and plummeting temperatures by downwards of 50 degrees. With almost all light being blocked and low temperatures, the morale of India quickly fell until they surrendered the country to Ohio. And for a while afterwards, Ohio faced little to no resistance. Anyone that tried to stand up to them fell quickly. North Korea, one of the few actual threats remained in Asia, attempted to nuke Ohio. However, the nuke that they launched backfired as a software glitch caused them to immediately turn around and hit them, allowing Ohio to walk in and claim control. Ohio, feeling confident, decided to once again attack the MWW, starting with Mongolia. However, the Mongolians had recently watched the Disney movie Mulan and took inspiration, baiting the Ohio army into a mountain range and then causing an avalanche that the Ohio army took heavily casualties from. Pulling back momentarily, Ohio decided to focus on Europe and the Middle East. Once again, Ohio began taking over countries with relative ease, cutting through them like they were warm butter that was just taken out of the microwave after being in it for at least 15 seconds. And the butter knife was also heated up, meaning you can barely even feel the butter as you slice through— No, wait, sorry, I got a bit carried away with the metaphor there. Anyways, carrying on, this butter metaphor lasted until the country of Hungary. Hungary, which had gone through a coup in 2028, had had a complete turnaround, now being one of the leading countries in technology, and their latest project was developed in the case of a superior army attacking. The drone wall. A modern military marvel that would make most military leaders cry with joy and make most engineers have a mental breakdown. Over 50 million armed drones formed a wall of sorts around the country's border. It had such a tight security that nothing could get through undetected, if it could get in at all, and the wall held up with ease against Ohio's best attacks. Ohio, however, decided to play the long game and turn it into a siege, blocking all attempts to bring food or supplies into the country. And after a month, Hungary's supplies ran out, and its citizens got hungry. However, Hungary had gotten intel that Turkey had accidentally spent its entire government's budget on freeze-dried turkey due to a misclick on Amazon. And this turkey was enough to feed all of Hungary's hungry citizens for months. And so Hungary took a risk, and took its citizens out of the country over to Turkey. They also put the drones on mobility mode, which made the drone wall move with them, allowing them to remain protected. And once Hungary and its hungry citizens reached Turkey, they declared war and took it over, stealing all of the freeze-dried turkey for themselves. However, they quickly ran into a problem. Their drone wall was only so big, and with Turkey, their borders had expanded by almost 300%, causing their walls to be less secure. And Ohio took advantage of this, and used this weakness to destroy the drones and take over Hungary and Turkey. And back to the butter metaphor, Ohio began taking everything else over easily, until finally it was just Ohio and the MWW left. And so, expecting the surrender of Great Britain, Ohio marched into their land. And this is what the MWW had been preparing for.
The year is 2150. The Milky Way
Most military leaders cry with joy, and make most engineers have a mental
has launched
breakdown.
itself off the Earth and set itself in orbit.
15-minute war, Poland was now under the control of
Overthrew the
Ohio's
Chinese
growing
government
threat.
and remade
This
China.
temporary
Greenland
group was called
legally
Mr.
changes
Worldwide,
Atlantis.
and immediately set
Ohio began marching their troops onto Britain's land with the intent to finally end the war and win. The moment Britain fell would be the moment that the MWW would collapse and fall into Ohio's hands, finally giving Ohio the entirety of the planet Earth. Ohio had debated on playing it safe, but ultimately decided that the best way to finish this war was to completely crush Britain. And so, they planned an all-out attack that involved the entirety of their military. And when they marched on shore, they met very little resistance, pushing inland with ease. In fact, everything was practically desolate. Ohio was beginning to worry about this being a trap, but when they finally reached London, they discovered that Britain had evacuated all of its citizens, leaving the city of London occupied only by its army. But before we go any further, I have to derail to cover two important topics that will come up later. Those topics being what happened to Sealand in Florida, and what happened to Texas and the former state of Ohio, which now resided out in space. Sealand and Florida had been wiped out when their tunnels collapsed, becoming the divides, but that's a lie. They faked their deaths in order to keep Ohio from coming from them. What actually happened is way back when Florida was baited underground by Ohio, and realized what had happened, they called a truce with Sealand and talked. So, they formed an alliance and decided to create a new society underground, safe away from Ohio. This new society fused the two names, Florida and Sealand, and they called it Orlando. This new society lived peacefully until they were overthrown by a rebellion consisting of people who were bent on seeing Ohio fall. This, of course, means that Sealand and Florida, now called Orlando, are back in the game. However, on to the more pressing issue, that being the state of Ohio in space along with Texas. Texas had been flourishing well in space. In fact, they'd been doing so well that they actually had been preparing to leave Earth's orbit and travel to a different planet. However, before leaving Earth's orbit, they had one more thing to do. It was a small thing, like a grocery checklist, and number one on that was destroy Ohio. And while that's all well and good, we still have one slightly bigger problem, the flying spiders that were sent into space via the state of Ohio. They had survived, and due to their reproduction speed, they had undergone extremely fast evolution, and the spiders had taken on a form more similar to humans, already having created their own society and quickly surpassed the technology the humans had. However, they didn't really have any vendetta against Ohio. I mean, they wanted all humans to die, but they didn't really hold a personal grudge against Ohio. So, with that context out of the way, let's return to the invasion of Britain and the battle for London. Ohio's troops began the invasion of London, a chaotic urban battle with heavy casualties on both sides. However, despite the attempts of the British, Ohio pushed forward, overpowering anything standing in their way, heading directly for Buckingham Palace. Ohio's troops finally reached Buckingham Palace and entered it, intending to seize the king and claim Britain as their own. Only to remember that after King Philip's death in June of 2028, the monarchy was abolished. In fact, not only the monarchy was abolished, but Parliament as well was removed. Britain's government was now actually run by kittens wearing top hats. It was pretty good government, aside from the fact that dogs were now illegal. Either way, there were no kittens or other government officials around. At first, Ohio had assumed that the dogs had started an uprising, and that Britain had undergone a revolution. But then the ground started shaking, and Ohio realized that, once again, they had been lured into a trap. And right as they went to call for evacuation and have their army board the boats, their entire navy was destroyed by a surprise attack from Britain's navy. As it turns out, London was easy to take because Britain had put all of its resources into its navy, giving it the power to not only quickly destroy Ohio's navy, but to keep Ohio's air force from interfering using its anti-air weaponry. And while being stuck wasn't a good sign for Ohio, it was probably worse that the entire island was moving, Ireland and all, further out to sea. Now, Ohio assumed that Britain's plan was to strand all of Ohio's forces off there and leave them to starve while picking off those who tried to escape.
But the MWW had a better plan. In fact, they planned to wipe what remained of Ohio's army entirely off the face of the earth. And they would wipe out Ohio using the latest military, the RTX gaming lit thermonuclear warhead. With the ability to change to over 30 different colors, this thing could wipe out anything in a 750-mile radius. The plan was once Britain was far enough out in sea, they would launch the missile and completely erase Ohio's troops from existence. They couldn't, however, launch the missile until Britain was far enough out due to concerns over the blast itself and the tidal waves that would be caused by it. This meant that Ohio had about 12 hours to get off of Britain. Now, let's give a rundown of the position Ohio was stuck in. Britain's navy had completely surrounded the island and would shoot at any of Ohio's troops they saw get even close to the water. Airlifts were out of the question, as any plane that got even close would get absolutely shredded by Britain's anti-air defenses. They couldn't go through, they couldn't go above. They could, however, go under. And down they went. They began digging a massive hole outside of London with the plan to hide inside it to avoid the blast from the missile. Only one issue, however. Where they were building the hole was exactly where the missile was aimed at. So when it was fired, it would go straight down the hole and eradicate every single one of Ohio's troops hiding in it. But with Ohio being unaware of the missile strike location and the MWW being aware of the hole, work continued. And 2 hours before the missile strike, Ohio had made an interesting development. And by development, I mean they'd accidentally dug into Orlando's tunnels, landing directly on top of their capital city, Miami, starting Ohio's second battle of the day, the Battle of Miami. Now, Ohio's forces were split into 2 sections. One was stuck up top on land, and the other was stuck in the hole, fighting Orlando. The troops stuck up top began setting up ropes and makeshift elevators to lower themselves in and help the other troops. But a mere 15 minutes before the missile's planned launch, new orders were received. The fight with Orlando was going poorly for Ohio, and they were beginning to lose, and staying above surface meant certain death. So, they decided to use the ropes and ledges to house all of their troops halfway up the hole, keeping them suspended there. As they put the troops in the middle, Orlando caught wind of what they were doing and began demolishing one of the pillars that was supporting the land Ohio's troops were hanging onto, hoping they could knock Ohio's troops down by collapsing the roof. And, with no time to spare, Ohio finished setting up all of their troops right as the missile was about to make contact. And, by sheer accident, the MWW had launched the missile directly into the hole without knowing. And with luck on MWW's side, Ohio was guaranteed to be destroyed, as the hole would just funnel the explosion right into Ohio's troops, killing them all and saving Britain from taking any actual damage. But Ohio, through its plot armor, was somehow luckier. Right as the missile went down the hole, the support beam was broken by Orlando, causing the hole to begin collapsing the moment the missile had made it through. And it struck at just the right time, to where the collapsing hole saved Ohio by redirecting the explosion entirely underground, completely removing Orlando once and for all. Now, an explosion of this power traveling through holes underground did have some effect on the world. Some major earthquakes around the globe, and the tectonic plates that made up South America and Africa got pushed towards each other and connected, forming a piece of what was once Pangaea. Ohio's troops climbed out of the hole with only some casualties, and they celebrated. Sheer luck had once again saved their lives. At least until they realized that the MWW had sent a second RTX gaming lit thermonuclear warhead towards them. However, this time, wanting to avoid a long and drawn-out action sequence involving them just barely escaping death through some luck and unconventional means, Ohio simply moved the Earth out of the way, causing the missile to miss. It was at this point that Ohio was able to escape from Britain, as Britain's navy had evacuated before the missile hit in order to avoid getting damaged by the explosion. So, Ohio evacuated and headed for Europe. Ohio, now off Britain and back in Europe, was preparing to march onto France, where Britain had evacuated all of their citizens to. But this, of course, is when Ohio was met with a new obstacle: Texas. Texas had stationed itself directly above Ohio while in orbit, and had begun launching down pods containing troops directly on top of Ohio's army, causing massive confusion and crossfire. During this chaos, however, Ohio came up with a plan. If they reacted the booster that they had attached to the state of Ohio at just the right time, it would crash into Texas and take it out. And that's what they did. They activated the thruster and sent it hurtling, only to completely miss Texas. As it turns out, the technologically advanced giant flying space spiders had modified the thruster, and they had planned on colonizing the moon, and then using the thruster as a way to launch the state of Ohio back into the planet, wiping out all the humans, basically recreating the dinosaur extinction asteroid. So, the thrusters were far more powerful than Ohio had anticipated. So when Ohio activated the thrusters, it went way too fast and completely missed Texas. Now, the state of Ohio bounced around the solar system for a while, until eventually it crashed into the sun,
unceremoniously killing the giant space spiders. F in the chat. However, the state hitting the sun at the speed it hit it at caused a massive solar flare that headed towards Earth, and as it neared, it was on the right path for hitting Texas, when once again, it completely missed and instead completely incinerated France. However, despite missing the country of Texas, the solar flare blinded its pilots, and they began crashing down towards Earth. However, by hitting random buttons blindly, they managed to regain just enough control to land Texas without breaking anything. In fact, they landed it right on top of what was once France, effectively replacing France with Texas. Whether that's better or worse, I don't know. Now, this might have been a problem, however, half of Texas was blinded from the solar flare, and Ohio's troops were stationed at the border due to their pre-planned invasion of France, so they simply invaded Texas instead, and took it over with ease. Now, Ohio once again spent some brief time celebrating, assuming that at this point nothing stood in its way, when it realized that while it was busy fighting France and Britain, the entire world map had managed to change. As it turns out, the moment France was incinerated along with Britain's civilians, the MWW had collapsed due to arguments between countries over what to do. So they each went off and prepared to do its own thing. Mongolia had begun to recreate the Mongolian Empire and had begun taking over large portions of Ohio's land in Asia. Poland took over Germany as revenge for the last few times. Italy went on to go join a new group to fight against Ohio, a new form of the MWW, except they got a little bit confused and ended up accidentally joining Ohio itself. Now, Spain was out in the mid-Atlantic, preparing something, Norway, Sweden, and Finland were off doing their own things, and Greenland was still pretending to be Iceland, and just overall having a good time. And that was it. 7 countries left until Ohio gained control of the entire planet. So Ohio started out with taking out the biggest threat, Mongolia. Now, Mongolia had focused on South Asia and had taken over China, India, and some surrounding countries. Ohio prepared itself for an intense fight to retake the land, and it was ready for Mongolia to have the newest weapons and technology. However, when they entered India to begin the attack, they came face to face with Mongolia's army. Instead of tanks and cars, Mongolia had horses. Instead of guns, they had crossbows. Instead of bayonets, they had spears. They were severely outdated, and Ohio had no real threat for them. So, they sent off half their army to head over to Norway to take it over while this half would retake and secure Mongolia. As soon as the other half had left, Mongolia began a cavalry charge on Ohio's troops. Ohio didn't pay them much attention, merely set up a few machine guns to fire at them and hold them back. Except Ohio quickly ran into a problem. They weren't slowing down. In fact, Mongolia was hardly losing its troops. A bit more concerned, Ohio began putting more troops to firing on them, and once again, it barely did anything, and the Mongolians were getting closer and closer. Now panicking, Ohio ditched the machine guns and began launching explosives at them rapidly, and from the smoke, the Mongolians once again pushed forward. Now they were losing more and more rapidly during their charge, but it still wasn't nearly enough to stop them. It was at this point Ohio realized something. They were surrounded. The cavalry charge was only a distraction to let a majority of Mongolia's army surround Ohio's. And what Ohio had assumed to be an army of only 3,000 to 4,000 revealed itself to be an army of 300,000. Ohio's army in this location was only half of that, going up to somewhere around 150,000. The battle that followed was a slaughter. Despite Ohio having the superior technology, the horses gave Mongolians a major advantage. Ohio's numbers began lowering. 150,000 became 125,000. That turned into 100,000, 75,000, 50,000. Ohio was facing certain defeat in this battle, so it decided to make a sacrifice. The missile that Ohio had moved the Earth to dodge had been caught in Earth's orbit, so Ohio moved the planet once again back into the path of the missile, and the RTX gaming lit missile hit right where the fight was. It did its job. It wiped out everything. Ohio had greatly weakened itself in order to defeat Mongolia, but it did the job, and with Mongolia's army gone, Ohio reclaimed the area. Now, at this point, Ohio had finally learned its lesson and was done underestimating countries. All it took was like 15 different countries doing the same thing to Ohio, but it had learned its lesson. Probably. Hopefully. And so, it moved on to Finland and sent its army in, slowly, only to realize that there was no one anywhere. It was desolate. Realizing that they had once again walked into a trap, Ohio called to retreat, only to realize that it wasn't a trap. All of Finland's citizens were just sitting inside, playing a video game. As it turns out, Bethesda had just re-released Skyrim for the 34th time. This time, it was called Skyrim Super Ultra Legendary Anniversary Todd Howard Edition. It had 15 more pixels than the last one, and cost $15 more. And all of Finland's citizens were playing it, so Ohio somewhat cautiously took over the country, but it faced no resistance. So Ohio moved on to taking over Sweden. Now, Sweden put up quite a fight, and when Sweden began showing signs of weakness, they enacted their plan. Sweden had formed a plan with Norway, in which once they began losing, Norway would send in its army, and Ohio would be caught off guard by the sudden growth of strength, which would give them an advantage. Sweden quickly ran into an issue, however. As it turns out, Norway had been taken over by Ohio a long time ago, except Ohio had just pretended Norway was still its own country. So when Sweden called in Norway's army for assistance, it just invited Ohio's army in, and then they promptly crushed Sweden's army, the country falling into Ohio's hands. As Ohio went to go now focus on Poland, they noticed that Poland had managed to take over the entirety of what was once the Soviet Union, and was in the process of building the Berlin Wall again. So Ohio of course invaded them and just kinda took them over. Poland did fight back, but at this point Ohio was pretty much just done dealing with countries, so Ohio just casually took it over. Now Ohio had two more threats to deal with, Greenland and Spain. So Ohio headed for Spain to start out. As Ohio was heading over, they got a notification that Google Maps needed an update. So they updated it and noticed that there was only one change. And that change was that Spain was now named Spin. When Ohio looked up from its phone, it saw Spin spinning rapidly in the mid-Atlantic Ocean. Spin, formerly known as Spain, had challenged Ohio to a Beyblade fight. Country Edition. Now, for those of you who don't know, Beyblades were actually directly inspired by the state of Ohio. If you take the state of Ohio and place it next to a Beyblade, you can actually see just how similar they are. In fact, without any sort of labels, it's nearly impossible to recognize which one is a Beyblade and which one is Ohio. Anyways, Ohio usually would have just airlifted the state of Ohio over to the Atlantic and used it to absolutely dominate Spin, but they'd kind of launched the state into space and eventually into the sun, so that was out of the question. So, Ohio used the next best thing, the state of Wyoming. For those of you who don't know, rectangles are actually the second base shape for Beyblades, the first best shape being that of Ohio, which is the model you will see in most grocery stores. So, they picked up Wyoming and placed it in the Atlantic Ocean, and the Beyblade competition began. Now, I would tell you what happened, but to be honest, I have no idea how to describe it. They hit each other a couple times. I think Obama showed up halfway through, some more hitting each other, and then Wyoming started glowing, and it hit Spain super hard and sent it straight through South America and Africa, actually returning them to their original positions. But Spin carried straight on until it collided with Antarctica, getting stuck there, leaving Ohio the winner. So, Ohio left Wyoming in the middle of the ocean, where it belongs, and moved on to the last and final country, Greenland. However, as it turns out, Greenland had actually been taken over, and it was now Iceland that Ohio was fighting. Things had gotten all mixed around with all the name changes and the location changes and all of that fun stuff earlier, so the countries just kind of forgot who they were. So Iceland was the final country. And at long last, the war would end. Ohio would be left the victor. So, Ohio sailed up to Iceland, only to realize that Iceland had once again switched positions with Greenland. So, Ohio sailed over to Iceland's new location, only to realize that Iceland had switched with Greenland again. This carried on for a couple of days, with Iceland switching positions with Greenland, until Ohio finally got tired of it and instead split their fleet up into two, sending one to Iceland and the other to Greenland, so that even if they switched, they couldn't escape. And as they neared Iceland, they realized that Iceland had switched positions with the state of Utah. So they sent troops over to get Iceland, which was now in the central US, except as you likely expected, it was gone. Instead of Iceland, it was now the island of Taiwan. So they went to go get Iceland to where Taiwan was at, only to get there and then immediately turn around to figure out where it had gone. Only to then realize that it hadn't moved and they had just kind of left it in the area Taiwan was at. But by the time they got back, Iceland had once again moved, this time swapping with Uruguay. This trend continued on for a while, with countries being put in random locations and Ohio just always being a second or two late. Finally, however, Ohio came up with a plan to defeat it. It split its army and navy across every country, so no matter what Iceland switched into, they'd run into Ohio's troops. And they caught Iceland trying to switch with Japan, trapping it next to Japan. So Ohio marched into Iceland only to find Texans on it. As it turns out, when Iceland had figured out Ohio's plan, they went and switched their citizens with the Texans, which meant that all of the Icelanders were now on Texas. So Ohio went to go get them, only to see them teleport to the moon. However, with Iceland no longer on the planet, and it being on the moon, and of the fact that Ohio had taken over Texas a while ago, this only meant one thing. Ohio had done it. It was done. It was over. The Earth was Ohio's. It had taken centuries worth of attempts, But after a decades-long war, they had finally done it. But despite having the Earth, Ohio was set on Iceland. So they began launching rockets towards the moon. However, Iceland, being Iceland, merely switched places with one of the Marge's moons. And when Ohio sent rockets towards there, Iceland moved the moons again, with this repeating, Ohio trying harder and harder to capture Iceland, or at least destroy it. And while I could go on to discuss the chase for Ireland, I need to address the issue at hand. Why is Ohio so set on Iceland? Ohio had the Earth, and Iceland clearly had no intention of fighting Ohio, only running away. So why did Ohio start spending all of their resources on catching Iceland? Well, it's because Ohio isn't actually Ohio. It's Greenland. In fact, Ohio hadn't been Ohio for a long time. Greenland had taken over Ohio long before the history I've been telling you. When World War III started, there were two sides. Greenland was on the opposing side to the Americans. However, they had not formally entered the war yet, and it decided to try to commit espionage on the Americans while they could get away with it since the Americans weren't expecting it. But during these espionage runs, one of their spies noticed the power that the state of Ohio had. The state on its own was completely unremarkable. There was nothing interesting about Ohio. So, Greenland hatched a plan. They would take over Ohio and begin building up a power and military, but because of how boring Ohio was, no one would pay attention to it because there's nothing to pay attention to. And so they did that. You already know this portion of history. They sent in politicians and took over other states and then started using military power, and then Texas launched stuff and all of that. But why would Greenland keep the name Ohio? Because Ohio as a concept is something to fear. A completely boring and uninteresting state, not only starting a civil war, but winning it against the strongest military superpower of the world? It was something to fear. Using Ohio, Greenland had a mask. No one knew what its next move would be, or its priorities. But in order to make sure no one suspected Greenland was actually Ohio, Greenland pretended to take over Greenland while being Ohio. And answering the question from before, it's because Greenland hates Iceland. I mean, don't ask me why they hate each other. Last I heard, it was over some dispute regarding pineapple on pizza, but I'm not the person to ask. And that was it. Ohio, the state we all know and love, was actually the country of Greenland all along. The world was surprisingly peaceful under Greenland's rule. It began a several trillion-dollar project to try to fix the planet, filling in the divides and moving countries back to where they used to be. Global warming was dealt with. The average quality of life was raised. All was well. It never ended its conquest, however. It took over solar systems, then galaxies, and it aimed to take over the universe itself. But to whether or not it caught Iceland, I can't say, as I don't know. But maybe one day, off in the future, we will know. But until then, be prepared for Greenland. Ohio was the mask.